Salam, jumpa kembali di Jejak Papua Channel. Sahabat, video ini adalah versi ringkas dari buku West Papua 1942 sampai 2022, Politik Hukum dan Satu-satunya Jalan ke Depan, karya Jacob Rumbiak. Ringkasan ini dibuat oleh Kantor Perempuan Papua Barat di Victoria, Australia, dan dipublikasikan dalam channel YouTube West Papua Women Office, Melbourne. Buku ini merupakan kompilasi foto dan teks sepanjang 50 halaman dengan bibliografi komprehensif dan tautan elektronik ke semua referensi yang dapat dibeli di West Papua Women Office atau dilihat online di link ini. Buku ini secara ringkas mendokumentasikan bagaimana masyarakat adat Papua yang sangat bertentangan dengan keinginan mereka menjadi orang Indonesia dan menjadi koloni Indonesia pada tahun 1960-an. Ceritanya dimulai dengan partisipasi masyarakat Papua Barat yang kurang dikenal dalam Perang Dunia II dan sebagai wilayah tanah pemerintahan sendiri selama 12 tahun di bawah pengawasan dan bimbingan Sekretaris Jenderal Perserikatan Bangsa-Bangsa atau PBB. Dokumen ini menguraikan bagaimana Presiden Kennedy, Presiden Indonesia Soekarno dan Soeharto, serta negara-negara anggota PBB dengan sedikit bantuan dari Direktur CIA mengubah wilayah tanpa pemerintahan sendiri tersebut menjadi sebuah koloni Indonesia. Buku dan video ini diakhiri dengan ringkasan yang jelas mengenai hukum internasional yang berlaku pada klaim lama West Papua atas penentuan nasib sendiri dan kemerdekaan yang terbaru dalam bentuk negara deklaratif. Berikut ringkasannya.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks to the International League of People Struggle for inviting me to your webinar. By way of introduction, I am on the bottom row of photos at your Congress in Hong Kong in 2019 with Nathaniel Chase, the great-great-great-grandson of John Adams, second President of the United States. It was a fortuitous meeting because I had just watched the great mini-series about John Adams when he was the Foreign Affairs Minister of America's independence movement, when it was in the form of a declarative state between 1776 and 1782, which is exactly what West Papua has been since 2020. This is Jacob Rumbiak from the West Papua ULMWP government. Like John Adams was, he is the Foreign Affairs Minister of a declarative state. Jacob has an extraordinary history as a freedom fighter, student and political prisoner in Indonesia, university lecturer and teacher of nonviolent resistance in West Papua, and a key strategist of West Papua's independence movement. This is West Papua, in the middle of the world marked with a star. The yellow dot is the Solomon Islands, where Lieutenant John F. Kennedy's torpedo boat was sunk by a Japanese destroyer in August 1943. The survivors swam 5.6 kilometres to Plum Pudding Island. An Australian coast watcher, Arthur Evans, loaded 2 Melanesian associates, Biuka Gasa and Eroni Kumana, with the almost impossible task of finding them. When they did, they told Kennedy to scratch a message on a coconut, then risking their lives again, rowed their dugout 55 kilometres back to Evans Base. Kennedy didn't forget the 2 Melanesians who saved his life, but 18 years later, he did betray their cultural and racial kin in West Papua to a dark, painful life as subjects of the Indonesian Republic. Today we'll discover how an ancient people, against their wishes, became Indonesian. We dive into their history during World War II, and then as a non-self-governing territory for 12 years between 1950 and 1962. The third section outlines how the United Nations, America under President Kennedy, and Indonesia under President Sukarno turned that non-self-governing territory into an Indonesian colony. The last section outlines West Papua in terms of international law, and the final slide is a bibliography with electronic links to all the references. On the YouTube version, you can pause to view each slide more thoroughly. It is useful to know that the West Papuan experience of Dutch colonialism was very different to the Indonesian. For Indonesians, it was violent and exploitative, beginning in 1600, when the Dutch East India Company, with guns blazing, found rich sources of nutmeg and became the richest company the world has ever known, with the equivalent of 7.9 trillion American dollars, which is equal to today's top 20 global companies. In contrast, at the beginning of World War II, only 5% of West Papua was under Dutch administration. Missionaries with Bibles, not guns, had landed in 1855, and their focus was as much on health and education as religious conversion. World War II for West Papuans began in 1942, when the Japanese Navy surrounded their homeland in just 8 months, except for Merauke in the southeast, where the Allies built a huge military base and 6 radar stations to prevent the Japanese from taking Port Moresby via Torres Strait. We don't know how many West Papuans were killed, starved, raped, or maimed during the war, or how much of their sacred land was destroyed. But just a couple of statistics from the Allies' Blitz in 1944 are illustrative. The US General Richard Eichelberger wrote, "Hollandia was converted into an immense military and air base and became one of the great bases of the war. Sides of mountains were carved away. Bridges and culverts were thrown across rivers and creeks. Gravel and stone was poured into sago swamps to make highways as tall as Mississippi levees. In the deep waters of Humboldt Bay, a complete fleet could lie at anchor. Tremendous docks were constructed, and 135 miles of pipeline were led over the hills to feed gasoline to the airfields. Where once I had seen a few native villages and an expanse of primeval forest, a city of 140,000 men took occupancy." End of quote. Down the coast at Sami, in a brutal contest for an unfinished runway and 3 hills, 400 Americans were killed and 1,500 wounded. 3,800 Japanese were killed and 11,000 died of sickness and starvation. Similarly, the assault on Biak Island produced 3,000 Allied casualties, 470 killed or missing, and 2,400 wounded. 600 Japanese were killed, with a further 4,000 missing, presumed dead. These are extraordinary statistics for a war ignored by military and social historians. What were the indigenous West Papuans doing during World War II? On the top left is a photo of the Oak Tree Party, a commando intelligence group that traversed West Papua's central mountain range, raiding Japanese posts, cutting bridges, creating diversions, training pigeons, organising supply drops, and negotiating with tribal chiefs like Wiyakibo. Oak Tree's reports were sent to the Allies' base in Merauke and then forwarded to intelligence headquarters in Melbourne. On the right is a photo of the Australian Army's Melanesian Battalion of Torres Strait Islanders. About 80 of them were sent to Merauke, where their particular skills were crucial for exploring sites for radar stations. Bottom right is a photo of Papuan police guiding displaced civilians back to Hollandia. Before the Allies' Blitz in 1944, General MacArthur appointed Jan van Eekhoyd, the former Dutch police commissioner, to organise the mopping up and rebuilding. Van Eckoyd was a strong advocate of self-determination, and by the end of the year had established a police training school, the Papua Volunteer Battalion of 400 soldiers, and a civil service school that produced many of the Papuans elected to the New Guinea Rad in 1961. Van Eckoyd also had the West Papuans join the South Pacific Commission established in 1946 to promote economic and social welfare in the non-self-governing territories of the South Pacific. For West Papuans, the war was over by the end of 1944, but not for Indonesians, whose vicious war of independence from the Dutch started just 3 days after Japan's surrender and didn't finish until 1949. On the 6th of December 1950, the United Nations registered West Papua as a non-self-governing territory. Worth noting in this table is the increase in Dutch spending on development from 15 million florins to 91 million florins, and that their plans for a plantation economy were abandoned when surveys showed that only 2 million of the territory's 41 million hectares, that is 5%, were arable, and that 5% was widely scattered in relatively small pockets. In November 1960, the Netherlands passed legislation for a central political body called the New Guinea Rad. Territory-wide elections resulted in 23 Papuans on the 28-member body, which was inaugurated on the 5th of April 1961 in front of representatives from every region in West Papua, the British, New Zealand, French and Australian governments, 135 officials from the South Pacific Commission, 10 members of the PNG Legislative Council, and a bevy of international media. The RAD declared 1970 as the deadline for the realisation of self-determination. That is, a referendum for the people of the non-self-governing territory to choose independence, free association with another state, or integration with another state. How did a UN non-self-governing territory get turned into an Indonesian colony? In 1961, UN Secretary-General Hammarskjöld was about to raise West Papua's status to independent nation in waiting. He was murdered 3 days before the opening of the General Assembly in 1961. So the Netherlands raised a similar motion, but the member states rejected it. President Kennedy then obliterated the non-self-governing territory in a game of poker with one of the world's great gamers, and organised for West Papua to be given to Indonesia. There were few winners in this Donnybrook of disorder. Hammarskjöld and Kennedy were shot, Sukarno was removed, the UN lost its integrity, and the West Papuans were shunted into an Asian republic that had just massacred 3 million of its own citizens. But Alan Dulles, mastermind of the US intelligence system, survived, and the US mining company Freeport, whose interests he had long championed, got 2 mountains of gold in West Papua. This is the legal view of how the non-self-governing territory of Netherlands New Guinea got turned into an Indonesian colony. It's another page deserving of a read on the YouTube version. West Papua, under international law, is an Indonesian colony, and colonialism under international law is illegal. West Papuans have a legal right to be free and a legal right to be independent. This is not just a moral right or a political right. It is a legal right, guaranteed by the UN Charter, under customary international law, and in the New York Agreement that Indonesia signed with the Netherlands in 1962. The road back to self-determination is another page worth reading slowly. Essentially, it is an abbreviated account of the West Papua ULMWP government, the legal and political representative of the West Papuans Declarative State. This government sits at the apex of a pillar of political power of the nation's three key political identities and a pillar of civilian power that includes the West Papua Council of Churches, the Adak Tribal Councils, and the youth, student, workers and women's groups. As President Benny Wenda said, when announcing the declarative state's Green State during the 2021 Climate Summit in Glasgow, now we have a constitution, government, cabinet, and a Green State policy framework to restore balance between the human and non-humans in our homeland.